to this evening's guest lecture by Professor Pemp. It's nice to see so many of you here, and testimony, I think, to the great talk we're expecting, given the popularity at 5 o'clock at night, when all decent Australians are out now having their first beer, that so many of you are here with us. Let me just give a very broad introduction to Professor Pemp, who's visiting us for about 6 weeks, I understand, at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He's joined Berkeley Political Science Department in July 2001 and served as Director of the Institute for East Asian Studies from 2002 until 2006, where he held the Han-Nu Chair in Asian Studies. Just prior to joining Berkeley, he was at the University of Washington in Seattle, and he was also adjunct professor in political science. From 1972 to 1991, he was at the faculty at Cornell University, where he was the director of Cornell's East Asia program. And I won't go through the list of numerous books that he's authored or edited. Needless to say, the list is very long indeed. I think the order of business tonight is that Professor Pemp will speak for around about 45-50 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and a Q&A session. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Pemp.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate the comments on the books, and I will just point out that the latest has just appeared. I got a copy yesterday, so for those who might be interested, I'll pass it around. You can dial up your Amazon account immediately and pursue it at great length at the risk of competing with my own talk. And I wouldn't be conforming to cultural stereotypes if I didn't begin with something that passes for humor or a joke. The story is told of Albert Einstein dying, going up to heaven, and saying that he deserves to go in, and St. Peter looking at him and saying, well, you look like Einstein, I can see the hair and everything else, but you have to prove that you really are Albert Einstein. Lots of people are trying to do anything to get in here. Einstein says, well, how about a chalk and blackboard? St. Peter snaps his finger. Instantly they appear. Einstein begins with the equations and begins to explain the theory of relativity. St. Peter is very impressed and says, well, Mr. Einstein, certainly welcome to heaven. And he turns around and suddenly there's Pablo Picasso. And he said, well, you know, you look like Picasso, but, you know, can you really prove who you are? Picasso looks at the equations that Einstein has left, takes the chalk, re-scribbles on them, and suddenly you've got Guernica there. And St. Peter says, geez, I'm really impressed. You certainly are Picasso. Please come in. And he turns around again, and here's George W. Bush. And he says, well, you're going to have to prove who you are. I just let in Einstein and Picasso, but only after they proved who they were. And Bush says, well, who are Einstein and Picasso? And St. Peter says, well, come on in. Now, you know, Bush does allow the late-night comics a great deal of opportunity, but the subject that I'm going to deal with tonight is, I hope, a little bit more serious. And essentially what I want to do is take a look at what I consider some of the major failings of the Bush administration with regard to Asia. I've titled the talk, as you can see, How Bush Bungled Asia. But essentially, I want to focus on a number of things. But in order to do that, let me start by trying to make the case for Bush as I read it, and I'm trying to be as honest as I can with a number of the supporters of the Bush administration. One of the points that an awful lot of supporters make is that generally American relations with Asia are good. Condi Rice has talked about the fact that the U.S. is in a stronger position in Asia than at any other time. Victor Cha, who was in the administration dealing with the six-party talks, has made many of the same claims. U.S. position in Asia is now stronger than ever, and Asia remains at peace. Essentially, I think the claims, or one stream of these claims, suggests that relations with the Middle East may be problematic. The U.S. may have lost some credibility with what is often called Old Europe. Latin America has seen the rise of a number of anti-American populist leaders, partly linked to the Bush administration. But essentially, Asia is not as bad as these other places, and that in many respects, there may be much better relations. Mike Green, who is a National Security Counsel, takes it even further in some respects, arguing that in many ways, Iraq has been the key to American success in East Asia, arguing that U.S. alliances are stronger, particularly the alliance with Japan, but also, he argues, elsewhere, the alliance with Korea. The essential point here is that many countries in Asia, seeing America's willingness to go to war in Iraq and its willingness to use its military muscle, have been positively impressed and, for one reason or another, have re-strengthened their ties with the United States or moved more closely to the United States as a consequence. And perhaps still a third point that could be made would be to say that, that America's overall image and overall collective strength has led not to galvanizing of opinion against America, but rather to an acceptance of the U.S. war on terrorism and an effort to align more closely with the U.S. And in addition to Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Singapore are often cited as cases of this. The United States has moved to a closer relationship with India that involves acceptance of India's nuclear pact or nuclear efforts. There is military cooperation in a host of areas, and many would also point to the fact that the U.S. military's assistance in the 2004 tsunami has led to a wave of popular support for the United States. So there is a certain case to be made that on certain areas, at certain levels, U.S. relations may not be all that bad. I think in many respects, when they talk about this, they set a very low standard or a very low bar. The fact that there is no conflict, no military conflict in Asia these days really reflects the fact that Asia has been at peace for about 30 years since the conflict with Vietnam, Cambodia, China in Southeast Asia. And this is not in any way due to anything that Bush has done. It's really not very clear that many of these bilateral or multilateral relations of the United States in Asia are any better after Bush than they were at the end of the Clinton administration. So it's very difficult to argue, as many of the Bush people do, that this is a consequence of specific actions by Bush. And I think the more fundamental question, and the one that I want to address in a little bit more detail, is the question of whether the path to the present was really marked by the creation of a number of avoidable problems and bad consequences that were the result of the Bush administration's policy. In effect, Fareed Zakaria makes the interesting point that some of you may have seen in Newsweek, I think a week or 2 weeks ago, that Bush has been on a learning curve, that the Bush administration is beginning to do some things right, including, for example, improving the relations with the six-party talks with North Korea, or improving its relations with China, et cetera, et cetera. But from my standpoint, the White House is an awfully expensive place through which to go through a learning curve, and it may be important to recognize that an awful lot of mistakes were made along the way, even if in the last year or so some turns in the positive direction have been made. I want to argue three things with you that are beyond the specifics of individual relations between the United States and country X, Y, or Z. I want to stress the fact that Bush's reliance on military tools has worked against the general trends in Asia and has been a negative. Secondly, that Bush's economic mismanagement in the United States has led to a diminished American influence in Asia. And third, that the Bush administration's focus on unilateralism and its unwillingness to engage regional institutions flies in the face of a move in exactly the opposite direction within Asia as a whole. So these are the three broad points I want to make, and I'll try to go through them with you in some detail. But in order to do that, I want to say a few things, particularly because I'm in an Asian environment, about the domestic base of the Bush administration. I think it's important to recognize, and certainly my understanding of some of the failings in Asia trace back to the particular electoral support base from which Bush managed, or the Republican Party with Bush managed to become president and from which they rule. The first of these, there are three main elements in this coalition. The first is what you might think of as security hawks, or those favorable to a strong military and industrial institution and a strong military presence around the world. The Democrats, by way of contrast, generally much weaker links in that regard. Very strong anti-tax groups, the Coalition for Growth, lots of anti-tax libertarians, those who are opposed to big government, Democrats generally more in favor of larger taxation, larger government. And finally, an important group that's reflected, in fact, in Sarah Palin's choice by John McCain, that is to say, so-called values voters, fundamentalist Christians, Christian conservatives, those who are taking a very strong position against abortion, against gay marriage, against a whole host of social issues on which they feel very strongly and on which they vote very strongly. America is an interesting place politically in terms of the whole notion of checks and balances and the notion that various institutions will balance each other out. We are not structured as some countries are for top-down tight leadership, but rather our process of governance can be very complicated. But the Bush administration really worked to try and override many of these so-called checks and balances. For much of its time, it had a Republican Congress and a pro-Republican Supreme Court. Many of the Bush policies were not challenged either in Congress or in the courts. And of particular importance, pardon me, to me, is this fact that Karl Rove, the electoral master behind the Bush administration, has operated to try to create what you might think of as a permanent Republican majority. That is to say, to use government policies as a way to reinforce and strengthen the electoral base of the Republican Party in the hopes, as he saw it, that the Republicans after Bush would have something akin to what the Republicans had after the McKinley administration in 1898, namely a roughly uninterrupted period of 40 years or so of conservative Republican rule. And in keeping with this, the Republicans pursued what Scott McClellan, formerly press secretary under the administration, called a permanent campaign. That is to say, instead of governing with an eye toward what the best policies are for governance, the concern was inevitably what are the best governance policies in order to ensure the continued Republican majority. So all issues were essentially politicized to maximize electoral benefits. At the risk of not paying as close attention to my time as I should, I'll share one anecdote with you on this. A good friend of mine was president of a company based in, I'll just leave it as an Asian country. He was identified in 2004 in a New York Times article as someone who was supporting John Kerry for president in an article that was written about Democrats and Republicans who were abroad but who were supporting various Republican or Democratic candidates back in the U.S. And he made some comments to the effect that he was really working very hard from his base in Asia to ensure Kerry victory. 3 days later, his boss in the United States, the CEO of the main company, received a copy of the New York Times article, underlined with my friend's comments underlined, and in the parentheses, the comments in the margin said, what has the Democratic Party done for your company, named, lately? You better get this guy under control, signed Karl Rove. My friend got a phone call very quickly telling him that he'd better keep his mouth shut and behave if the company was going to keep him on board. So there was this permanent politicization of an awful lot of what went on in the United States. And of course, as I'm sure everyone here knows, an awful lot of American foreign policy was driven by the so-called neocons and a strong realist perspective globally. I won't go through the mistakes that were made in Iraq. Suffice only to say that ideology tended to take greater precedence over military and strategic planning. There were an awful lot of comments made before the invasion of Iraq that we would be greeted by the people in the street with flowers and roses, and that the Iraqis had no internal religious conflicts that would lead to difficulty, et cetera, et cetera. And it's taken roughly 6 years before the United States has begun to even begin to gain some merit of military control in the area. Let me turn quickly, though, to Asia and simply start by saying the United States has long had a very strong and dominant military but also economic position within Asia. This was obvious militarily with the wars in Korea and Vietnam, not necessarily that they redounded positively for the United States. The United States maintained a series of bilateral alliances across Asia that in many ways created an arc that the U.S. called the Arc of Stability around from the Aleutian Islands through Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia, around to Diego Garcia, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. has maintained a strong naval presence in the Pacific. But importantly, the United States was also, I think, a force, and I may sound too American in this regard, a force for promotion of certain human values, promotion of economic development, the promotion of what many people call soft power, becoming a beacon for education for many Asians who wanted to study in the United States. So the U.S. presence in Asia was clearly much more complicated than simply that of a military hegemon throwing its weight around. And I think importantly, in Northeast Asia, the United States served as something of a balancer between China and Japan, keeping Japan from remilitarizing and spending a great deal of money on the military, which provided assurances to China, while at the same time pushing back against China so that Japan did not feel the need to expand its own military forces. And in many ways, I think it's possible to say that the United States won the Cold War in part by virtue of its tremendous support for what has become the Asian economic miracle and opening American markets to the export of Asian goods, while at the same time providing a military support base to try to keep some measure of security across East Asia. Now, what I think we've seen since then, and I'll go back to my three big themes, is starting with the incredible militarization of foreign policy under Bush. We saw the U.S. shift away from this complex mix of economics, military, education, culture, and the like, to a focus exclusively on the military. A couple of easy data to keep in mind. The U.S. spends more on defense than that of all the other nations of the world combined. This is not exclusively Bush's fault, but it certainly is a testimony to where the United States stands. The United States now has more musicians in its military band than it has diplomats, which says more, I think, about the United States. And again, this is not purely attributable to Bush. But also this year, the U.S. Army will add 7,000 more troops to the Army. That is more than the United States has as in its entire American Foreign Service. So that suggests something about the directions that American policy has moved in. But Bush himself took that already strong American military presence to a new level, particularly with his speech about the axis of evil, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, but also with the increase in military spending, with the CIA renditions policy, with black sites, with the Abu Ghraib scandals, with Guantanamo, and with the scrapping of an awful lot of existing multilateral institutions to which the United States was a member, replacing them by these so-called coalitions of the willing. In effect, the U.S. had a mission. If you would like to join, if you are willing, fine. If not, we will go ahead without you, because now the name of the game is you are either with us or against us, to repeat one of the oft-quoted phrases by President Bush. The United States, of course, as a result of the war in Iraq, first of all, well, let me back up. Following 9/11, the U.S. had an incredible measure of global goodwill. Le Monde had that very famous headline that we are now all Americans after the toppling of the Twin Towers, and in many ways the world was quite ready to see the United States push back against Islamic fundamentalism and to go after the Taliban in Afghanistan, but Bush in many ways undercut that by the unprovoked invasion of Iraq, based on what many of us now realize was cherry-picked intelligence and a pre-commitment by the neocons, who were a very important part of the base, who had wanted for a long time to topple the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. And there's been a huge drop in American popularity globally. I will not go through the 423 polls that I looked at, but Pew, BBC, a whole host of these multilateral polls show a tremendous fall off in American support, popular support for the United States. One interesting indicator, though, is that now negative views of the United States outweigh positive views anywhere from 50 to 55%, and they've been rising, whereas negative views of the United States negative views have gone up and are at the 50 to 55% level. Positive views are in the 30% range, 38 to 28%. So positive views have dropped very considerably of the United States across the world, including in Asia, and big drops in countries that are normally very pro-U.S. Japan, Australia, the ROK, the Philippines, etc. Within Indonesia, with its strong Muslim population, the U.S. dropped from 75% popularity to 30% over a 6-year period. I guess the only thing to be said against this fall in public opinion is that the hardcore realists and neo-realists essentially take the position that public opinion doesn't matter. What really matters is how government leaders get on, how the militaries get on, etc. I would challenge that notion by pointing out that as East Asian governments have become increasingly democratic, a number of them, not least of which Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, have all gone through a lot of explosive changes in their foreign policy as a consequence of being seen as too close to or too allied with the United States. And this is becoming an increasingly important problem for the United States. Importantly in this context, as the U.S. under Bush has moved toward militarizing its foreign policy in Asia, Asia has been moving almost in the opposite direction. Now, this is not to say that Asia does not have security problems, does not have tensions, does not have unresolved territorial issues, but basically no major wars in East Asia since the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. There's a very interesting datum up there that indicates the drop in military expenditures relative to GNP, declining from 2.6% in '85 to 1.8% in 2001, and parallel declines in most states in the proportion of the military budget that has been given over to central government as a proportion of central government expenditures. In effect, East Asian governments are generally spending less on the military as their economies go up than many other portions of the world, Latin America, the Middle East, most of Africa, etc. Now, there are clearly some genuine problems there. Many people worry about the modernization of the Chinese military. There is a relatively high level of spending for the military as countries get richer, but generally speaking, as one person was pointing out, when East Asian leaders tend to get together in multilateral forums, they are mostly talking about economic growth, about trends in trade, about problems of investment, increased cooperation. They're not talking about threats that one or the other poses to one another, and in fact, the climate in East Asia has broadly changed, it seems to me. It's true that U.S. military ties have gotten very good with a number of countries, with Japan, with Singapore, but these were also very good before Bush. And more importantly, I think, Japan's links have become increasingly militarized at the expense of Japan's overall position in Asia. Japan has moved far to the right during the time since Prime Minister Koizumi took over, which is almost the same time that Bush took over. South Korea, relations have gotten much worse, particularly during the Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun regime. Current administration has tried to swing back more toward a pro-conservative, pro-U.S. position, but that's running into a great deal of difficulty at home. I would argue that relations with ASEAN have gotten, in many ways, collectively worse, in part due to the marginalization that the Bush administration has carried out toward ASEAN. China ties mixed, somewhat pragmatic. They got off to a dreadful start. They've improved in some ways, but as I'll suggest in a minute, the United States is largely schizophrenic with regard to China. Parts of American policymakers wanting closer ties, particularly in economics, parts, particularly in the Pentagon, worried about a China buildup and a China military threat. And the last point I would make, and I will talk about this as well, is that I think relations with North Korea and the overall handling of the North Korean nuclear problem have been a consummate disaster. I'm going to be very quick on Japan. I had more to say about this, but I want to simply sketch this for you. Essentially, Japan's position prior to the prime ministership of Koizumi had been to take a very low posture militarily. After 9/11, Koizumi moved very quickly to align Japan closely with the United States. Japan sent SDF, Maritime Self-Defense Force, ships to support the invasion of Afghanistan and the Indian Ocean. He sent a small contingent of troops to Iraq, even though they had to be protected by Australian soldiers. Thank you guys very much. He upgraded the status of the self-defense forces. He also put a massive aid package in place for Iraq. Now Japan has become headquarters to I Corps, 1 Corps. They've moved to Camp Zama in Japan from their base in Washington, the state of Washington, meaning that Japan is now part of the broader planning of U.S. military forces going all over the world, or at least all over the Pacific theater, which includes India and Central Asia. Japanese troops now participate in Operation Cobra Gold with Thailand and others. Japan shifted its position on Taiwan to make it much fuzzier as to whether Japan would or wouldn't support Taiwanese independence, or where it would support Taiwan in a possible confrontation. The Coast Guard has been expanded. There are a whole host of things that have happened. But the end result of this, I think, is that Japan is now talking about constitutional revisions and runs the risk, I think, of clear isolation in the rest of Asia. Koizumi was particularly problematic with his visits to the so-called Yasukuni Shrine, which alienated Japan from China and from South Korea, which felt that he was showing insufficient sensitivity to the issues of Japan's position during World War II, and was strongly criticized. But during the Koizumi administration, there were no summit meetings among the top leaders of Korea, China, and Japan, and relations deteriorated considerably. As I said with regard to China, the United States has been very ambivalent. A lot of engagement of China economically, huge trade between the two places. The U.S. is now increasingly dependent on China to support American debt, but there is also simultaneously an effort to hedge against the modernization or the expansion of the current Chinese military, and the United States has been pushing missile defense in conjunction with Japan, the allegation being, or the claim being, that this is directed against rogue regimes like North Korea, but many in China's military are quite convinced that they will be at least as subject to the effectiveness of the missile defense as anything in North Korea. And so there's this very ambivalent position, it seems to me, with the U.S. in regard to China. I mentioned the trade. These are just some numbers that support it. But the U.S. debt, as it has increased, has given China a much greater lever over the United States. China now holds a huge portion of the current American debt. And this basically goes back to the Pentagon. The Pentagon's starting position is that it will allow no peer competitor in Asia. That is to say, America's military force must be far and away preeminent in Asia, and moves by any country such as China to close that gap will be immediately resisted. So the U.S. is split between its economic wings and its military wings as to how to think about China. Within ASEAN, as I said, I think the U.S. has marginalized ASEAN, not taken it terribly seriously. Condi Rice skipped the ASEAN Regional Forum meeting in 2005. A number of other top leaders took her lead and bailed out or left early. She was chastened and returned in 2006 to the meeting, but then in 2007 she skipped it again. George Bush postponed the 30th anniversary celebrations of the U.S.-ASEAN partnership. And meanwhile, I think ASEAN can be said to have moved much closer to China as a result of the free trade pact that China has put in place with ASEAN, and particularly as a result of China's openness to agricultural exports from the ASEAN countries through this program called Early Harvest. And let me turn last to North Korea and the Bush administration on North Korea. Cynics would say that the United States under Bush began with an ABC policy, anything but Clinton. If Clinton had done it, we're going to do the opposite. And this was certainly true with regard to North Korea. Colin Powell was briefed during the transition period. Well, not everybody's as familiar with the details. I'll back up just one step. You may recall that at the end of 2000, up to and right after the election of 2000, George Bush and Secretary of State Albright were in close negotiations with North Korea. Madeleine Albright had gone to North Korea as a way to lay the groundwork for a possible normalization of diplomatic relations between the United States and North Korea. Some real progress had been made. There were problems, no question about it, but there was clearly a move in the direction of progress. It was even bandied about that Bill Clinton might make a trip to North Korea. Once the Supreme Court decided the election in favor of Bush, it was clear that, and the Bush people made it clear that they would not go along with this. The chances of Clinton going to North Korea backed off very quickly, but the negotiators with North Korea briefed Colin Powell, the incoming Secretary of State, on the negotiations and how things stood. Colin Powell, just prior to a visit by Kim Dae-jung to the United States, announced that U.S. policies toward North Korea would in many ways continue from where the Clinton administration had left off. Once his claims or comments hit the press, he was immediately taken to the woodshed by the leaders of the Bush administration, probably Dick Cheney, but George Bush nominally, and told that that was not going to be the forthcoming policy. And Colin Powell made the now famous comment that he had gotten a little far ahead on his skis with regard to North Korea policy, and that there would be a complete review of North Korean policy. George Bush was quoted as having made a complimentary phone call, or taking a congratulatory and introductory phone call by Kim Dae-jung, and he'd been briefed on Kim's efforts, and apparently as Kim was saying, we've got to negotiate with North Korea, Bush put his hand over the phone and said, who is this guy? He doesn't know anything about foreign relations at all. He's the most naive guy I've ever talked to. So clearly Bush began with a very different view of North Korea than his predecessor had done. A very hard line taken with the so-called axis of evil speech, lots of comments about the need for regime change in North Korea. During the October visit by Jim Kelly, October 2002 visit of Jim Kelly, the United States claimed that North Korea was putting in place a highly enriched uranium program, which if true would have been a violation of the existing accords. North Korea had stopped its plutonium provision, and that was subject to IAEA inspection, but there are two ways at least to make nuclear weapons. There may be more than that if there are any experts in the field. The two I know about are plutonium and HEU. North Korea had clearly brought in centrifuges from A.Q. Khan's Pakistani network. Whether that was enough to actually have an HEU program or not is still subject to a great deal of debate. European allies who have been shown the evidence seem to think that nothing serious was going on. But regardless of that, 2002, things really began to deteriorate. Once the six-party talks began, many in the diplomatic field said the United States should follow a carrots and stick approach. The South Koreans were pushing for carrots to reward the North Koreans for doing positive things. And John Bolton, who was very much a player in this, said that I don't do carrots. That was his famous quote. That is to say, it's going to be all sticks. Dick Cheney said, we don't negotiate with evil, we destroy it. Bush was quoted on numerous occasions as talking about Kim Jong-il as a pygmy, as an evil man, et cetera, et cetera. Rice talked about North Korea as an outpost of evil. So there was this incredible verbiage that was going on, which was hardly conducive to diplomacy. Eventually, and it's a long story, and I'm happy to get into it in the Q&A, but I want to get through the rest of the broader story. The United States finally softened some of its positions, but only after a series of missile launches by North Korea in 2006, subsequently in October, nuclear test that essentially made North Korea clearly a nuclear power. And not coincidentally, I think, because I think domestic politics plays a big role in what the Bush administration was doing or not doing. The Democrats won control of both houses of Congress in 2006, November of 2006. So starting in January of 2007, the U.S. Suddenly began to negotiate with North Korea on a bilateral basis under the six-party talks, something it had refused to do prior to that. And we've seen some real moves forward in the six-party talks since then. There's an interesting secondary set of issues here as the U.S. has been pushing Japan to move further to the right or take on a more conservative tack. Japan and China have fallen into very different positions within the six-party talks, and Japan is now the furthest to the right, demanding a full accounting of the abductees taken by North Korea from Japan during the 1970s and 80s, and resisting any efforts to encourage Japan to provide provide economic assistance to the North, et cetera. So there's been a real change in those policies. Summary statement is that while many would say, and many Bush defenders would say, America's relations with Asia are in pretty good shape, I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that in lots of places there are some very serious problems, most of which trace back to the excessive militarization of American foreign policy. The second big thread I want to take up, and I'm going to be a little bit more brief with this, although I probably should spend more time on this since this is a public policy school and you guys are probably all steeped in economic theory and would love to talk about this ad nauseum. But suffice to say that I think the Bush administration's fiscal policies have demonstrated a certain level of economic mismanagement. Fiscal and monetary policies, I think, have been more or less a disaster. The Clinton administration left a surplus in the budget of $236 billion. It was projected that if no changes were made in the basic structure of the American budget and the taxes that continued, that by the end of 10 years there would be a surplus of about $5.6 trillion. George Bush came into power saying, $236 billion, that's a lot of money. That is your money. I'm going to give it back to you in the form of a tax cut. The tax cut, of course, had a very particular bias to it. Most of the tax cuts went to the Republican base, very minimalist reduction in taxes for anything that might remotely approach the middle class or below. The use of economic advisors was a very small part of the Bush team. You may recall that Secretary of the Treasury Paul O'Neill was essentially fired when he challenged the support for agribusiness and when he challenged the need for the tax cut policies. Larry Lindsey, the major economic advisor, was fired when, among other things, he suggested that the war in Iraq might actually cost as much as a couple of $1 billion. We're now approaching a couple of $1 trillion. Lindsey was off, but in the wrong direction. He was accused of having overstated the cost of the war. And basically, Dick Cheney took the position that the tax cuts were essentially a part of the Bush administration's economic policy. As he claimed, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. We won the elections. This is our due. In other words, we will reward our supporters. The tax cuts are a critical part of what we ran on, and we are going to deliver on those. But of course, in addition to the tax cuts, the U.S. faced an increasing problem with the rising costs, the rapidly rising costs of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. The latest hard numbers I had were that the war combined was costing $750 billion. It's costing about $10 billion a month. There are now books out talking about the possibility that the combined wars will actually cost much more like $3 trillion. Probably none of us in this room can even envision what those numbers really mean. Suffice it to say that it's created a mammoth gap between the taxes coming in on the one hand and the expenditures going out on the other. And the end result of that is that the United States has moved rapidly into debt The federal government debt has nearly doubled from 5.6 trillion to over 9.5 trillion just since 9/11 and 2008. Roughly a third of the current U.S. federal deficit has been created since George Bush came into office. And in one of those quotes that I think is more telling about the philosophy than anything else, George Bush once said, actually he said more than once, I was campaigning, he said, in this case he said I was campaigning in Chicago, and somebody asked me, is there ever any time when the budget might go into deficit? And he said, I said it would only be if we were at war or had a national emergency or we were in a recession. And little did I know that I'd hit the trifecta. That is to say, the U.S. is at war, there's a national emergency, and we're in a recession. So every good reason to be running a deficit. Lots of numbers on the debt, but the point that I think is most important for thinking about Asia is the fact that roughly half of America's current debt is held by foreigners, and the bulk of that is held by Japan and by China, which shifts the leverage politically and economically from what was once a U.S. advantage to a tremendous advantage for those countries. There's been an 80% drop in the value of the U.S. dollar. If any of you are still invested in American stocks, you're watching it deteriorate. If any of you, like me, are Americans who hopped on an airplane and went to Europe, mistakenly thinking that you could actually survive there, you realize that your Big Mac is costing you a month's salary in Norway, etc. But the incredible problem that this creates is that the United States once had the capacity to use a great deal of economic leverage vis-a-vis Asia, opening markets, trade negotiations, currency dealings, and the like. That, for the most part, is now gone. And importantly, in thinking about domestic politics, the Bush administration policies have led to the tremendous loss of jobs at home. The Bush administration has the worst job creation record of any administration in post-war history. There are some incredibly interesting but quite negative comparisons of economic performance under the Bush administration with prior administrations. And on virtually all of these, whether it's stock market performance, unemployment, inflation, etc., the Bush numbers are dreadful or worse. And equally importantly, from my standpoint, and the argument that I would try to make is that as part of the Bush administration's loss of jobs and huge tax cuts to the rich, et cetera, there's been a widening income gap in the United States, with more and more Americans becoming less secure about their own economic futures, whether it's in the form of actual loss of houses or loss of jobs or loss of income, or simply the fear that what they thought was a permanent job may disappear tomorrow or next week or the week after. And that has very profound consequences for American trade negotiations, because the big fear now, the cliched fear now, is that American jobs are being shipped to Asia, and America needs to create jobs at home, needs to protect against foreign economic invasions, whether that means forcing the Chinese to revalue their currency, or whether it means protectionism against Korean or Southeast Asian imports, is all part of the same process. But just as one easy indicator on this, the United States was not able to match China with a free trade pact with ASEAN, nor was Japan able to match that because of its economic protectionism in agriculture. The Korea-U.S. free trade agreement is in serious trouble at home, etc. Finally, let me turn to the third point, and that is to say the unilateralism under George Bush. George Bush came into office convinced that multilateral treaties and multilateral institutions were an impediment to U.S. freedom of action globally, and so he proceeded within the first months of his administration to scrap a whole host of agreements that the United States was party to: the Kyoto Accord, the Convention Against Small Arms, Biological Weapons, International Court of Justice, etc. What did I do here? Oh, I've got this set up a little bit differently. The U.S. seems to like some institutions where it's dominant: the WTO, the IMF, But generally speaking, and particularly under Bush, it much prefers bilateral security arrangements, a hub-and-spoke arrangement, opposed to anything other than a la carte multilateralism. That is to say, you pick and choose when you want to be part of multilateralism and policies based on coalitions of the willing. When I look at East Asia prior to the economic crisis of 1997-98, I would say very quickly, regional institutions were very thin. We had ASEAN, we had APEC, we had the ASEAN Regional Forum, but APEC and ARF were both trans-Pacific. The United States was part of that regional process that was taking place in East Asia. They had very thin secretariats. They were thinly developed. They were not the European Union, but they were there in place, and they were part of something that the United States could involve itself in. With the crisis of 97-98, I think there was a change in thinking across Asia about the thinness, the weakness of institutions, and about the pan-Pacific nature of the existing institutions. During the crisis, APEC was unable to do anything, not that it had been set up to do anything. ASEAN didn't do anything. And so I think there was a notion that more needed to be done to think about creating new institutions. So ASEAN has been taking a number of regional institutions. We've seen a growing importance for the ASEAN +3. We've seen the East Asia Summit put in place, that is to say the ASEAN +3 plus Australia, New Zealand, and India. The six-party talks represent another example of a multilateral process. The Shanghai Initiative, which is a series of currency swaps, is in place. Asian Bond Market Initiative is also being put in place by ASEAN +3, et cetera. All of these regional bodies are going forward. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, not exactly East Asia, it's China, Russia, and Central Asia. But all of these moves are taking place to create new regional bodies from which the United States has either systematically excluded herself or been systematically excluded. The East Asia Summit, the latest of these, is an interesting body simply because it has taken on a very wide agenda. It includes economics, it includes security, it will potentially include environment, finance, and other things. It remains to be seen whether the East Asia Summit will actually be able to deliver on some of its kumbaya-like statements about the future and cooperation. But again, importantly, the United States is not included. Everyone who is a member has signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which essentially means peaceful solutions to diplomatic or security problems. The United States has made it clear that it's not prepared to sign any such statement. And I won't bother with Shanghai Cooperation. I'm sure many of you know about it, but essentially this has the potential to be a very important regional body for China to increase its influence in Central Asia. And this is actually a military and security and economic cooperation venue that many would argue is a potential anti-NATO pact. Again, the United States not particularly happy by that development. So overall, I want to suggest that the United States has on many dimensions under the Bush administration seen a decline or demise in its overall influence. China in some ways has stepped into the U.S. vacuum and is playing a somewhat leading role in Asian regional institutions, in Asian trade, and in Asian economics. There's been a certain amount of cooperation and coalitions of the willing in which the U.S. is involved with the six-party talks. India and the U.S. have improved their relations, but not to the happiness of many other parts of the world. And at the popular level, there's been a dramatic decline. Whoops, I screwed this up again. I did this on a previous presentation. I have no idea how to rescue this. Where am I? Does anybody know how this thing works? Let me see if I can do this. Okay. We're going to have to go with my non-quite technical presentation here. But essentially, the picture that I see of Asia vis-a-vis the United States right now is that for the most part, Asia wants the U.S. in the region to balance China, to balance Japan, to provide more options at the economic and at the security level. Generally speaking, I think that there's an acknowledgement of U.S. military preeminence in the region, and it's not always resisted and it's not always opposed. I think Asia acknowledges the U.S. preeminence and the importance of U.S. markets for Asia's overall development, and I think, generally speaking, there is cooperation with the U.S. or an effort to cooperate in dealing with problems of terrorism, but simultaneously there's a general feeling that relations with the United States have to move to something closer to an egalitarian or an equal or at least a more reciprocal partnership. And this, I think, has been something that has been in the offing for quite some time. Now, by way of concluding comments, I want to offer a somewhat different suggestion. Everything I've said has been rather critical, I think, of the Bush administration. But I think in many ways this may represent a sort of hidden blessing for Asia. Because in many respects, this now provides an opportunity for the countries of Asia to begin to think collectively about how they might want to deal with the problems of the region without the overbearing shadow of the United States forcing the agenda and pressing a U.S. view of how Asia should move forward. So in many ways, the Bush administration's abdication from Asian involvement or being AWOL from Asia has allowed Asia greater flexibility, greater freedom to think about how it wants to go forward. The interesting question for me at this time of the election in the United States is whether an incoming administration will be in a position to reverse the decline in American influence across Asia and to do so in a way that is going to have a positive impact on the relations between Asia and the United States. That is to say, to create something more akin to a partnership than something that would involve a big brother, little brother relationship that might have characterized American relations with many of the countries of Asia in the past. I think the first thing that a new president should do upon taking office or even before taking office would be to spend a little bit of time in Asia on a listening tour, not so much telling Asia what it should be doing, but rather listening to Asians who have a very successful track record that allows them, I think, a greater voice, and listening to where Asia would like to see the relationship with the United States go and how the U.S. can play a positive role in conjunction with the countries of Asia. So let me stop on that note. I'm not sure if I can ever turn this off, but there we go. Oh, that was simple. Let me stop on that note and see if I can turn it over to you for reactions, questions, disagreements, tomatoes, or whatever you may want to lob my way. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for a very expensive, interesting talk. I've been told by the technical people here that if you wish to pose a question, if you would please to press the button in front of you so that they can actually record this onto tape. With that in mind, could I open the floor to questions, please? Sure, just there.
My name is Deepak. I enjoyed your presentation. I just wish to know, one, are you Democrats? Two, you didn't mention about U.S. influence on Burma crisis or Myanmar. And do you see that Asia is very much fragmented? East Asia, Caucasus, ASEAN, SAARC, and then some other Central Asia. So how is Asia going to deal with U.S. when themselves are...
How is Asia going to deal with the U.S.?
When themselves are so many fragmented?
Yeah. Very important question. If I were to suggest that I'm going to keep my political affiliations private, I can't believe that any of you would believe me. But no, I am a Democrat. I'm actually, and I've actually sent more of my paycheck to Obama's campaign than my wife would like to acknowledge. So my partisanship is on the table. Well, I don't want to go into that too deeply. If you want to discount what I've said as excessively partisan, by all means, feel free to do so. But my partisanship is on the table. But in any event, as far as the question of can Asia collectively deal with the United States when it can't get its own ducks in order, I guess would be a phrase that Americans would use, is, I think, important. But Asia is a very complicated place, and I don't need to say that here. And I don't think that necessarily there has to be one Asian voice that somehow is pitted against an American voice. I think that there are and deserve to be multiple voices in Asia. There doesn't have to be agreement. And I think my view on regionalism and regional cooperation is one that says Asia does not have to replicate the European Union and somehow have a headquarters, an Asian headquarters somewhere that speaks with the voice of all of the members. There's bound to be a lot of differences across Asia. It's a very complicated place. But I think there can be agreement on many pieces of things. And Asians can very legitimately differ with themselves, for example, on the question of how to deal with Burma or Myanmar. China has one view. Several of the countries in ASEAN seem to have a very different view. And the United States has its rather hard view on sanctions and the like. What I'm encouraging is for the United States to be far more capable of listening to the various voices across Asia and to bringing more expertise to the questions that they have to deal with, rather than simply assuming that it has the automatic answers. I mean, I would love to see a dialogue between the United States and China on how to deal with Myanmar, Burma. I imagine that would not be something on which the two would agree, and it would probably be a very different view of how to deal with Myanmar than, say, would be the dialogue were it to be held with Thailand or Singapore. You know, I simply would encourage the governments of Asia to continue what they've been doing all along, which is to have dialogue with themselves and to recognize that there are wide differences, and at the same time for the United States to be part of that dialogue and to recognize that there's going to be a plurality of voices. So.
Beyond the economic and diplomatic issues that Asia has or will have, one of the glaring things that I see missing from the dialogue is the environmental resources issues that China and the rest of Asia are going to be facing, and they don't tend to address that, or don't, as far as I can tell, really take that issue that seriously. It's avoided and ignored even by the local population generally in Asia.
You saying it's being avoided in Asia or being avoided by the U.S.?
In
or
Asia,
both?
but the U.S. administration hasn't done much for themselves
Okay.
either. Obviously, the Bush administration hasn't until recently, you know,
Right.
embraced that whole global warming issue. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what might happen and what types of cooperative arrangements might take place in Asia.
Yeah. I mean, one short answer is to say I was told that I should talk for 45 minutes, not an hour and 45 minutes. So there are plenty of other issues on which there's been problems, and I think you're pointing to the environmental problems is a very good example of this. My reading, for example, of Japan is that a number of administrations, but not least of them Koizumi's administration, were very committed, and I think the Japanese government as a whole is committed to much better enforcement of environmental regulations and trying to take global warming seriously. There probably are other voices in Asia that are at least somewhat inclined in that direction, but clearly there are massive problems with the environment coming out of China, coming out of India, massive new uses of fossil fuels as these countries begin their economic development. And I think, as you know, as anybody could legitimately claim, it's rather unfair for the industrially successful parts of the world that created most of the current problems with global warming to say now to the newcomers to economic development, gee, you guys really should get the environmental message and go green, which de facto would mean stay where you are economically and allow us to enjoy this huge gap. So I think whatever measure of cooperation is eventually worked out is going to have to involve the richer countries providing economic support for the now developing parts of the world to embrace more environmentally clean technologies. But you're right that the United States has done very little in this regard. I don't doubt but that China would be more than willing to cooperate on a number of cleaner technologies if the economic incentives were there. I mean, there's close cooperation now between China and both South Korea and Japan in trying to contain the pollution from the Gobi Desert and the brown rain, et cetera, to create cleaner smokestacks in China using some of the Japanese technology, et cetera. So I don't think there's an inherent opposition on the part of China to being more environmentally sensitive. I think it's simply a question of when the trade-off becomes environmental sensitivity versus growth, we're going to opt for growth. And so I think the long-term trend has to be to balance off the economic incentives that are provided in order to encourage that kind of sensitivity. You clicked your mic back on as though I triggered a response, so go ahead.
Just briefly, I think long-term wise, the environmental issues and the resources there are going to limit the economic ability of the country to even function. So literally, that's going to be hand-in-hand issues, not opposing, but actually, have to be taken both into account. Working together. So
and I guess I would simply add, and probably we'd not disagree on this, that issues of energy, access to energy, become critical parts of this, as virtually all countries in Asia now are heavily dependent on fossil fuel imports, and China certainly is very dependent on this, and there's in effect a broad race to gain access to various energy sources around the world. And so I would, as a good Democrat, would like to see a much greater attention paid to alternative fuels, and I think Asia would be a wonderful place to test some of that out. But you're right that there are a host of issues there that require attention.
Let's just one more question over there, then we'll just jump back there. Sure.
Thank you. I want to ask some question about the relation of the U.S. relation of China. For me, I'm a Chinese. I think most of our Chinese think Bush administration, the Clinton administration is better than Bush administration, because in the Clinton administration, the U.S. economy we think is better, and also maybe maybe the 911 also gives some attack about some side effect to the economy in the U.S. But we think maybe the policy of a Bush administration is not suitable for the U.S. So I wonder if Obama can be the next president. I'm wondering whether the Democrats will return to their strategic partnership, this principle with China. Because we always think the democratic is maybe have a better relation with China. That's my question.
Yeah, and I have to give a very partisan kind of an answer, because what's very interesting to me is that many countries like China feel that the Democrats in the United States government would be great for China, but in Japan, you get the absolute opposite side. The Japanese all want Republican administrations. They're scared stiff if the Democrats come close to power. I was actually in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs doing interviews in 2004, and there were Bush posters all over, elect Bush. And I asked one of the very senior officials if this was normally the view of the ministry, and he said, "Oh, we are not allowed to have partisan views. We have good relations with all countries." And I said, "But I just saw those posters." He said, "Oh, no. That, you must have been imagining these things." So clearly different governments across Asia will have their partisan views, and they will favor one administration over another, just as most Americans will have their favorite views of one party over another. You're certainly right that the Clinton administration claimed that its relationship with China was that of strategic partnership. The Bush administration came in and turned that phrase into strategic competitor, which obviously takes a very different look at China. I think, let me say something positive about Bush, and this accords with Fareed Zakaria's point, and that is to say that Bush, I think, has been on a learning curve with regard to China over the last couple of years. And I think China has endeared itself or made itself necessary to the Bush administration in regard, for example, to the six-party talks. I think that China has played a very positive role. In some cases, China behind the scenes was doing some very strong-arm activity with regard to North Korea, including cutting off military exports to North Korea that don't show up in the statistics or the newspapers. So the Bush administration, I think, has learned over the course of the six-party talks that China and the U.S. can cooperate in a very positive way on this kind of specific issue. And George Bush went to the Olympics. I don't know that he was rooting for Liu Jiang, but he was there anyway, which I think the Chinese government is very pleased about. So I think there has been an effort by many of the people in the Bush administration over the last couple of years to engage much more positively with China than was the case during the first 4 years or 5 years. But I know that if Obama becomes president, the probability is that an awful lot of very pro-China people will come into the administration with him. And if McCain is elected, I suspect it will be a harder line toward China. And the probability is that John Bolton, for example, will find a position in a new McCain administration. So unfortunately, the Chinese don't get to vote. Otherwise, the election outcome would be very clear. And I've had this discussion with many Europeans who said that if the election were held in Europe, it would be 80-20 for the Democrats. But unfortunately, we have to have American voters only. So. But I do think that not everyone across Asia is quite so committed to a pro-Democratic Party platform as you might be. So you and I can put our shoulders to the wheel later on, and others will be pushing back on the Republican side.
First, I have to apologize for having missed the very beginning of your talk, and my apologies if you already addressed this. But the one area where the Bush administration seems to have been making some progress is in the Paulson talks with the Chinese in the efforts to develop a broader, more sustainable kind of framework. It is not clear to me how that would continue into either an Obama or a McCain administration. And if you think about their advisors on Asia, somebody like Jeff Bader, who's coordinating Obama's Asia policy issues, or someone like Michael Green, who's involved with McCain, what would they be likely to do with that kind of a dialogue? And more broadly, do you have any reason to believe that they have thought through this institutional architecture that exists in Asia and thought about what the U.S. role ought to be in it?
Yeah. Good question. I think there is actually some discussion going on the future architecture, and I think a lot of it has been contained within the NESAD process, Northeast Asia Cooperation Dialogue process. You may know that Susan Shirk has been running that for a long period of time. And Susan is among the group of people that are now advising Obama. But more to the point, and I don't know how deeply she's involved. She's certainly not doing the same amount of work that Jeff is, because she was a Hillary supporter, and she probably is licking her wounds still. But quite seriously, there's a lot of discussion now, I think, going on within Northeast Asia Cooperation Dialogue. It's a track 2 diplomatic activity about the future architecture of Northeast Asia in particular, and the ways in which the existing six-party talks can be recalibrated to try to take up a number of issues that might emerge in the future and to take advantage of the current levels of cooperation, albeit mixed cooperation among those 6 countries, to put in place something that would be available for the future. Now, how much of this would be economic as opposed to security, I think is also an important question. And whether, for example, an Obama administration or a McCain administration would try to revitalize APEC as a way to reflect more American interest in economic engagement with Asia, I don't know. But I think there is some thinking going on with regard to future architectures. And there's actually a proposal now. The MacArthur Foundation has put out, this is all in-house trivia, so the rest of you can tune off your headphones. And I promise to get back to the bigger questions in a second. But there's a MacArthur Foundation proposal looking at the future architecture of Northeast Asia, and they've got a request for proposals out now, and they're looking for a lot of this input from Asian institutions. And I'm actually involved in, as a PI, trying to coordinate 4 universities, including the California system and Tsinghua, Todai, Tokyo University, and Yonsei on this. So we're putting in for thinking about this. So there's some thinking going on, but whether it's going to come through Jeff or Mike or from outside, I don't know. Okay. A question that the rest of the audience can care about?
Hi, my name is Lee. I'm a Singaporean. I used to be a U.S. green card holder.
Okay.
First of all, thanks for outlining, what I've always believed, that this is the worst administration that the Americans have ever voted in.
I'm still voting for Buchanan, but we can argue about that.
The other one is, do you ever see a situation where the U.S. will come into conflict with China and India over the Middle East, where you notice the fact that the Saudis, for the example, when the current king came into power, his first trip was to China and India rather than into the U.S.? I mean, the reason why I'm suggesting it is because we all know why he went to the Middle East. The Middle East, because that's where oil is coming from, where the oil markets are. But traditionally, the Americans have always considered the Middle East their market, their domain.
Right.
Do you see a situation where the president will be culturally obliged to try and defend their interest? And 2, do you see a possibility that the American administrations, the political establishment, has become culturally disinterested in Asia? You notice that they've had big tours to Europe, but there's nothing much in this part of the world.
Let me take the last point first and work backwards. I think there is a general problem in the United States with, I don't know whether it's cultural insensitivity or geographic lack of knowledge about Asia, but generally speaking, I mean, the starting point, and this is always very difficult for foreigners to understand, and by foreigners I mean everybody, including Canadians, who aren't really part of the United States, despite what the Americans think. The difficulty is that Americans can be very, very introspective and very narcissistic, and they assume that the world begins and ends within the 50 states of the United States, and what happens overseas is marginally interesting. The Leaning Tower of Pisa sort of is interesting, and we like the samba, but it's all sort of a blur. So, I mean, that's a starting problem in the United States, and it's particularly acute as you move off the coasts. The East Coast tends to be much more interested in Europe, generally speaking. The West Coast, more interested in Asia, generally speaking. Kansas, interested in Kansas. Nebraska, interested in Nebraska. So that's a fundamental problem. And that little statistic that I put up about the fact that we have more people in military bands than we have in the diplomatic service is an unfortunately telling sign of how little the American government puts into this kind of knowledge, and the universities are suffering from this. It's getting tougher and tougher to convince students that they should learn a tough Asian language in order to know more about China, Japan, Korea, India, whatever. So all of these are serious impediments, and so it's really incumbent upon the rest of the world to somehow shake America collectively by its lapels and say, wake up, we're out here. But I think there are people in the political and business elite who are very aware of what's going on in Asia and who follow the dollars, follow the money, and who are very interested in developments around here follow the security issues. Now, how do I link this back to the Middle East and oil and whether the United States could go into military conflict with China and India over the Middle East? That's a scenario I would have trouble creating. You're certainly right that we're now seeing competition for energy becoming a global problem. And the U.S. policy traditionally has been to say the oil market, the energy market is a global market. It doesn't matter if you have security relations with an oil producer or not. Eventually, oil is sold on the global markets. But, as you correctly point out, the United States went to war in Iraq. It didn't go to war in Rwanda, or it didn't go to war in Ecuador, or it didn't go to war in Zimbabwe, or you can pick your number of countries. And you don't need to be a genius to suggest that oil might have had something to do with this. A very interesting argument, if you're interested in regionalism, I think, is to suggest that historically the United States has based its Asian relations on a primary relationship, a primary alliance with Japan, and built around that as a result. Its Europe relationship has been primarily with Germany and then secondarily with countries around that. And those two, Germany and Japan, have been the big anchors of America's bilateral and multilateral links to the region. And that what the Bush administration was really doing in Iraq was trying to create a pro-American military and economic ally in the Middle East that would, in effect, embrace democracy and somehow provide this spill out for the rest of the region. Obviously, they were slightly misguided in the pursuit of that policy, but if you think in terms of America's geostrategic doctrines, that's at least a partial justification for why they might have gone into Iraq, and oil would be a very big part of that. I think right now, China in particular is doing its best to create hard bilateral relationships with oil producers so that it will have guaranteed contracts of energy or of oil or of natural gas back to China. And I think the U.S. views this as a potential security threat. Right now, I think the U.S. still has primacy within Saudi Arabia and much of that region, but when the Saudis are dancing with the Chinese, that Dick Cheney's going to be paying attention. And I guess I'm just going to have to back off. I really don't think I know enough to say, yeah, you can expect a war in 2015, or this is never going to happen. I think it's an interesting scenario to worry about, which is one reason why I think the arguments that Tom Friedman and others have been making that the United States needs to end or reduce its dependence on Middle Eastern oil have a lot of credibility and a lot of validity. But I'll have to leave it at that.
Yeah, you brought up the Olympics, and I think you wrote once that it was after the Tokyo Olympics that Japan made its big economic bounce. Do you see Japan or China making a bigger economic bounce after having the Olympics?
Oh, it's always lovely to have somebody quote back to you something you wrote 10 or 15 years ago. It's nice to know that there's a collective academic memory. So let me thank you for that kind footnote to me. I did. I argued that the 1964 Olympics were a very powerful impetus to Japan's economic growth. I would add that South Korea benefited considerably from the '88 Olympics. And I would say that I'm a little skeptical about the absolute causality on this. I'm not sure that I want to make the argument that the Tokyo Olympics catalyzed Japan's development or that the Seoul Olympics catalyzed South Korea's. What I'd be more inclined to say is that gaining the Olympics was an early recognition by the world that these countries had really begun to make major economic progress from which they actually took off in a very positive direction. Japan had begun to make some serious progress, and so the Olympics in '64 was a kind of legitimation of that and a recognition of that. And after that, of course, Japan had invested a great deal in infrastructure from which it benefited considerably. Korea did much the same. I think I think China is doing much the same sort of thing. I mean, what's the number, $39 billion that they put into this Olympics? God knows. They've done an incredible amount in terms of building infrastructure from which China will continue to profit in the long term. Roads, bridges, harbors, infrastructure, internet, all of those things are now in place. At the same time, pardon me, China's beginning from a much lower base, it seems to me, in terms of per capita GNP than Japan or Korea enjoyed when they had the Olympics. So China's got further to go. You're going to see a lot more of that positive payoff in China in places like Shanghai, in Beijing, than you're going to see in Xinjiang or Yunnan or in the West. But I think, everything I read suggests that China is now on a very positive trajectory for growth. Lots of problems internally. Potential for political unrest is very high. Potential for a massive economic bubble that could collapse is high. So it's going to require a lot of very skillful economic management by their technocrats. But right now, if I were forced to invest 50% of my forthcoming retirement pension somewhere in Asia, a big chunk of it would be going to China, and I don't think I'd be alone in that bet. So.
Just one more question, just up the back.
My name is Jong. I'm a senior MPP student. You mentioned that the U.S. keep maintaining hard line against North Korea since Bush took office. But maybe this year, North Korea eliminate the nuclear facility in Yanbian, which is border city between China. And rumor has it that U.S. support several $1 billion to North Korea at the compensation of removing nuclear facility. My question is, what makes new icons in Bush administration change their attitude against North Korea?
Yeah. Good question. I think several things came together at the same time. The six-party talks had been essentially going nowhere, achieving no diplomatic success for the first roughly 4 years. North Korea then engaged in missile tests. It carried out a nuclear test. So it became very clear that even if that test was not a huge success, that the North Koreans could blow something up, and it might be the neighborhood. So it posed a very genuine threat. And simultaneously within the United States, or almost simultaneously, Chris Hill was really given a greener light to go ahead in negotiating. Chris Hill had taken a very strong position all along that he would only take his position as head negotiator if he actually had the leverage to negotiate. Jim Kelly, his predecessor, had been essentially ordered to stick to a series of talking points, a series of statements in the negotiations. And so all Jim could do would walk in and read the statement over and over again. And the North Koreans would say, well, what does line 4 mean? Does that mean you could do X or Y? And he'd say, blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, it's a very un-American kind of tactic. I mean, that's what the Americans usually expect and what many of us experience when we deal with third world dictators who, have their talking points and have no flexibility to move. Some of the neocons were pushed out of the administration. John Bolton was on his way out. And Scooter Libby was under indictment, so Cheney's office was under a bit of a cloud. So, there were a whole series of changing domestic configurations in the United States, including the 2006 elections, where the Democrats managed to gain control of both the Senate and the House. So, I would say, two big things were happening. Domestic political conditions in the U.S. were changing, which made Bush feel like he had to be more flexible. Actually, three things. The negotiations had stalled and were going nowhere, and it was clear that if they continued, North Korea was probably going to get more nuclear material rather than less, and that what they'd been doing before was not working. And then third, I think North Korea had pushed back in an effective way by carrying out a nuclear test that made it clear that that regime change was not going to be the successful message for the future. So all of these things led to changes. And just sort of a 30-second add-on that you didn't ask about, but that I'm going to push out there as well. There are many people, not least of whom Mike Green, who's basically oriented toward negotiations, but a lot of people in the United States, and certainly a lot of people in Japan, who feel that the United States moved too suddenly and too quickly on this. That for 4 years the United States had said absolutely no movement, and then suddenly everything began to move much more quickly, much more smoothly. The Americans seemed to be saying, oh sure, we can do this, we can do that, let's be friends. And certainly Japan was left feeling that its views on the abductees issue were not adequately heard. Many in the United States were skeptical about moving too quickly with the North, and so, and we're now seeing a bit of a pushback. Conservatives in the United States are pushing back against removing North Korea from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and the North Koreans are reciprocating by saying, we shut down Yongbyon, but we still have material for 6 or 8 nuclear weapons, and you can't attack us in the meantime, and we'll hold on to that, and we may restart Yongbyon. So I think we're in a very dangerous position again in those negotiations, but I hope I've given you some sense of why I think things changed in 2006, 2007.
And on that note, unfortunately, we're going to have to end it here. I know we could probably go on with a conversation for another hour or two, but please join me in thanking Professor Temple for a marvelous talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.